Good morning, welcome back to the channel. It is time for the next instalment of Holes. We're picking up from chapter 36. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in the burnt black sack in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack. Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said. I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign and then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck and wished he had at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach and let himself fall to the ground. Stanley couldn't wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but now it was destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he, too, felt the effects. He looked at the big thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they first set out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked. Just give me a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then using the shovel, pulled himself back to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign, and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at the big thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, then wait maybe 10 minutes before looking at it again, to see if it seemed any closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realised, they'd still have to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was once a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine, really. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting in the boat with her boyfriend while her boyfriend rowed. Zero used the shovel as a third leg. Zero's legs weren't enough to keep him up. I've got to stop and rest, he said. He said after a little while. Stanley looked at a big thumb. It still didn't look any closer. He was afraid that if Zero stopped, he might have to get started. It would never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or the big thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. And Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction for a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade. And then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think that he might need to dig a grave. Zero's last hole. And who would dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero didn't get up. And then Zero did get up, once again flashing thumbs up. Give me some words, he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds to realise what he meant, and then he smiled and said, Zero sounded out to himself, run, good, F-U-N, un. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It kept giving him something to concentrate on beside his pain and his weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked up at the big thumb, it really did look closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted. Yet, as bad as he felt, he knew Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. It was possible, he thought. He hoped that they didn't get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria was only in the jars which opened easily, the ones that were now carrying in his sack. What scared Stanley the most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than what he felt now. In fact, maybe at the moment of his death he would feel too weak to feel pain. Death would be a relief. What worried him the most was the thought of his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and his father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look out for Zero, but no one cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. Stanley had family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she would tell them, and when. "What do you think's up there?" Zero asked. Stanley looked to the top of the big thumb. "Probably an Italian restaurant," he said. Zero managed to laugh. "I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer," said Stanley. "I want an ice cream sundae," said Zero, "with nuts and whipped cream, bananas and hot fudge." The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up towards it. They came to the edge of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shores where Camp Green Lake was sitting, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they had been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb out of it. They could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked out the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. "I'm all right," he whispered. Stanley saw a rut, about a foot wide and 6 inches deep, running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. "Let's try there," he said. It looked to be about 50-foot climb, straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up the ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times, he had to use the side of the rut to support in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him. Somehow, his frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide ledge. Zero came up alongside him. "You okay?" Stanley asked. Zero gave him the thumbs up. Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he would get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't have any footholds. He was afraid to look down. "Give me a boost," said Zero, "and then I'll pull you up with the shovel." "You won't be able to pull me up," said Stanley. "Yes, I will," said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped on the interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero high enough up for him to grab at the protruding slabs of rock. Stanley continued to help him up before Zero pushed himself onto the ledge. While Zero was situated up there, Stanley attached the sack to his shovel by poking holes through his burlap. He held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed the hold of the sack, then the shovel. He set the shovel so that the half the blade was supported on the rock, and the wooden shaft hung down for Stanley. "Okay," he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was one thing for him to lift Zero, while he was half his weight. It's quite another for Zero to try and pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed the rock wall, using the sides of the ruts to support him. His hands moved one over the other up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hand grasp his wrist. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength, and for a brief second he seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall with Zero's help, pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way they could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took him a moment to realise that it was Zero's blood. Zero had a deep gash in both his hands. He had held onto the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. He brought back his hands to his mouth and sucked up the blood. One of the glass jars had broken in the sack, and they decided to save the pieces. They might need it to make a knife or something. They rested briefly, then continued on up. It was fairly easy to climb the rest of the way. When they reached the flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball balancing on the top of the big thumb, like God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. Okay, that is chapter 36. We will go straight into chapter 37. "We're almost there," said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now they really were almost there. It scared him. Big Thumb was only a hope. If there was no water, no refuge, then they would have nothing, not even hope. There was no exact place where the flat land stopped and the mountain began. The ground kind of just got steeper and steeper. Then there was no doubt that they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. It became too deep to go straight up. Instead, they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed directions. Patches of weeds dotted on the mountainside. They walked from one patch to another, using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher and higher, the weeds got thicker and thicker. Many had thorns, and they had to be careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to have stopped and rest, but he was afraid they'd never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. Besides, he knew they didn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began to appear above the weed patches. A swarm of gnats hovered around them, attracted by their sweat. Neither Stanley nor Zero had the strength to try and swat them away. "How you doing?" Stanley asked. Zero pointed to thumbs up. Then he said, "If a gnat lands on me, it will knock me over." Stanley gave him some more words. B-U-G-S, he spelled. Zero concentrated hard and then said, "Boogs." Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's sick and weary face as well. "Bugs," he said. "Good," said Stanley. "Remember, it's a short if there's no E on the end." "Okay, here's a hard one. How about L-U-N-C-H? Zero suddenly made a horrible wrenching noise as he doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body shook violently. He threw up, emptying his stomach of sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths up. Then he straightened up and continued. The swarm of gnats stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boys' faces. Stanley didn't give him any more words, thinking that they needed to save the strength. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, Zero said, "Lunch." As they climbed higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker, and they had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in the thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realised something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. "Weeds and bugs," he said. "There's got to be water around here somewhere. We must be getting close." A wild, clown-like smile spread across Zero's face. He flashed a thumbs-up sign, then fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. "Come on, Zero," he said. "We've got to get going. Come on, Hector. Weeds, bugs, weeds, and boogs." Stanley shook him. "I've already ordered your hot fudge and sundae," he said. "They're making it right now." Zero said nothing. That's chapter 37. Let's go for chapter 38. It's a short one as well. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearms and pulled him upright. Then he stooped down and let Zero fall over his right shoulder. He stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He left the shovel and the sack of jars behind. He continued up the mountain. Zero's legs dangled in front of him. Stanley couldn't see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated on one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought about each step, and not the impossible task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came from somewhere deep inside himself, also seemed to come from the outside as well. After focusing on the Big Thumb for so long, it was as if the rock had absorbed his energy and now acted like a giant magnet, pulling him towards it. After a while, he became aware of a foul odour. At first he thought it came from Zero, but it seemed to be in the air, hanging heavy all around him. He noticed the ground wasn't steep anymore, and the ground flattened. A huge stone rose up ahead of him, just barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to be growing bigger with each step. It no longer resembled a thumb, and he knew he'd never been able to climb it. Around him, the smell became stronger. It was a bitter smell of despair. Even if he could somehow climb Big Thumb, he knew he wouldn't find water. How could water be up the top of a giant rock? The weeds and bugs survived only by the occasional rainstorm, like the one he'd seen from camp. Still, he continued towards it. Nothing else he ever wanted to at least reach the thumb. He never made it. His feet slipped out from under him. Zero's head knocked against the back of his shoulder, and he fell and tumbled into a small, muddy gully. As he lay face down in the muddy ditch, he didn't know if he'd ever get back up again. He didn't know if he'd even try. Had he come all this way just to... You need water to make mud. He crawled along the gully in the direction that seemed to be the muddiest. The ground became gloopier. The mud splashed up as he slapped the ground. Using both hands, he dug a hole in the soggy soil. It was too dark to see, but he thought he could feel a tiny pool of water at the bottom of this hole. He stuck his head into the hole and licked the dirt. He dug deeper, and as he did so, more water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, first with his fingers, then with his tongue. He dug until he had a hole that was about as deep as his arm. There was enough water for him to scoop out with his hands and drop onto Zero's face. Zero's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked out between his lips, searching for the droplets. Stanley dragged Zero closer to the hole. He dug, then scooped some more water out and let it pour out of his hands into Zero's mouth. As he continued to widen his hole, his hands came across a smooth, round object. It was too smooth and too round to be a rock. He wiped the dirt off it and realised it was an onion. He bit into it without peeling. The hot, bitter juice burst into his mouth. He could feel it all the way up to his eyes, and when he swallowed it, he felt its warmth move down his throat and into his stomach. He only ate half, and he gave the other half to Zero. "Here, eat this." "What is it?" Zero whispered. "A hot fudge sundae," replied Stanley. Okay, that is the end of chapter 38. We're going to stop there, and I'll continue this after the weekend. But there's lots of clues in those last couple of chapters. We've heard about someone walking up a mountain before, maybe carrying someone. There's also a nice link to who the boat was named after, Mary Lou. There's also another clue with the onions. So if you think you know any of these answers, answer below in the comments, and then we'll see if you're right when we come back to this. Until then, stay safe, keep inside, and I shall see you all soon.